That was just really, really fun and interesting two talks. Um, I will resist asking Stathis about harmony and reason in Plato, but I want to, Christopher. I will suppress my. I always teach Woodson in my philosophy of education class. I wanted to. You made some remarks that about the relationship between art history's ideals of art and what you took, what I assumed was your own position. But I was less clear about your own position. The way you described art history's ideals of art, you used conflicting words. You talked about freedom and then used the expression automatic apprehension. And so I agree there'd be, let's, and I wondered, I mean, some of that fits Elaine Locke's conception of art. I mean, Elaine Locke is, as you know, responding to the view with horror that you should have your view. So.
Yeah, I can respond. No, I think, so to the first part of the question, part of how I guess I would think through it would be from sort of the, I guess taste is in there, just like the artist side and the spectator side, right? So the artist as like the maker, right? Sort of this idea of freedom, right? Sort of freedom to make and sort of not have process inhibited by thought, right?
And that's law.
Right, yeah. But then on the other side, there would be this idea of the spectator should, like, of not seeking explanation, right? So, and why I sort of maybe, part of what I'm interested in maybe taking issue with that or thinking about that, some of it comes out of teaching in an arts-based institution, right? Some of it, so at RISD, there's a video that our students made called The Room of Silence, which came out about 8 years ago now, 2016. So we do a lot of critique work at a place like RISD. You know, you make art, you critique it, you engage it. So a lot of students who are not cis, not white, not sort of normative in all those ways, especially the black students, often have experience of critique where no one knows what to say about their work. And no one knows what to say because the only sort of discursive mode that they are familiar with is sort of I can speak about the context that I know, right? But if you sort of bring a context that I'm not sort of already familiar with in an experiential sense, like I don't know what to say beyond talking about form. So for example, their critique of something like the Savage piece would not talk about James Weldon Johnson, God's Trombones, the collaboration with Langston Hughes, wouldn't talk about sort of what the New Negro movement represented in terms of black artists really trying to think about, you know, being these generations out past slavery, sort of the quandary of the racial mountain that Hughes talked about, right? So they wouldn't care about any of that. They would just talk about, it's this tall, like, so that's kind of the point that I'm speaking to. And there's a mode of art historical thought that finds that evacuation of context as a good thing, right? Evacuation of context that one doesn't already know, right? You can only bring context if you've lived it. And I think that, given who ends up in these institutions, right? Like, if you can only bring the context that you yourself have experienced in schools that cost, in the case of mine, over $80,000 a year, you know what I mean? Like, that then creates a certain dynamic. So I say that to say perhaps part of my thinking is informed by sort of pedagogical experiences over time. That maybe addresses it? I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, no, I mean, not being black, it's hard to go into this, but my experience somewhat with my black artist friends is they feel pushed into talking about
and that's what I said, but I think like that's actually, it's funny because I think that's sort of why Hughes' racial mountain is still so resonant. That I think, and that's also why for example, you have the sort of post-blackness group, you know, Glenn Wigan, folks of artists, and then you have sort of another route that are sort of the inheritors of the Larry Neal tradition who sort of pointed to limitations of that, but don't view, so I have this conversation with students all the time. If they ever see this video, they would laugh, right? But it's because it's the same conversation, right? Of is sort of specificity a trap, right? Do you then sort of, are you always then expected to perform that specificity in a certain type of way, right? But then I would respond like, is that expectation all that is at stake, right? Because yes, if you're talking about being in a certain art world, sure, but art doesn't only live in that world. It lives in like the houses and the storefronts and the everyday, you know, where those anxieties that you experience in the art world proper, you know what I mean? Like, don't exist the same way. But it's an ongoing conversation.
Thank you both for, this sounds weird, for your talks. I guess I have a question for Christopher and a comment for Stathis. And Christopher, I'm wondering, just following up on what you were just saying now about how art can be found in all these places, where would you put, in terms of education, educational spaces that are not classrooms, universities, and schools, right? The basketball court, the recording studio, the orchestra is definitely a pedagogical space, right? So I'm just wondering where you would place that. And the comment is about Sun Ra and myth. And I think it's really important to remember why Sun Ra espouses this mythology, right? He says in several different places, you know, in films, in interviews, in his broadsides, that the reason he sort of pursues this mythology, mythography, et cetera, and so on, is that in this world, Black people are actually not real. They're myths, right? They're these kind of screens upon which things are projected, and therefore he is making use of that, right? So, so him having this kind of mythological stance is not only about him wanting to fantasize, et cetera, and so on. It's very much about, it's a critique of an anti-Black world, right? And it's also a critique of the limitations of how art and music is conceived in this in this world as well. So, thank you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, but at the same time, he is creating myth, or he is. You know, myth for me is a term that is very positive. It's not a negative term. It does not mean falsity. I mean, it does mean falsity to people who want that, but myth is a certain mode of knowledge, a profound mode of knowledge that defies analytical categories, and that it is in fact performative and embodied. And this he understood very, very well. In his connection also to everything that has to do with Egyptology and all of the stuff that he inherits in the early in the 50s in Chicago, where he's part of that whole of that whole movement. So it is a way to try to speak to the community in a different language, and then this is how I understand it. As I understand all sort of myth performative instances, and to create myths that don't exist, of, you know.
It's slightly different because for Sun Ra, creating myths does not defy logical categories. He's saying that for him to create myth is precisely to be logical in this world that perceives him and other people like him. So it's I do think it's a slight shift in accent, but it's a really important one, because he's basically also saying, not only am I a myth, but this is a world that creates myths that I'm not a part of, right?
Yes, but it does not mean, I'm just sorry, that it's important to create myths precisely because you know, you are taken out of the equation. Anyway, I mean, okay, sorry, yeah. Go ahead, you had your hand up too. I mean, I thought you were...
I want to respond to the question as well. Thank you for that question. It actually gives me a chance to talk about something I didn't get to in the talk, with really two things. One is, I also have a background as a freedom school teacher, sort of out of the Children's Defense Fund situation. I worked in Oakland and other cities, and that's sort of an outside space that I really was thinking about like this, in terms of freedom school is very much, won't get into the history of that, but why I think about it pedagogically is that it's a space, for those who maybe don't know, the Mississippi Freedom Movement, part of what came out of that was a mode of education that was really community driven. Folks like Ella Baker are people to thank for that. But really this idea that in order to be educated in a way that is not the type of miseducation that Woodson talks about, Blackness really requires these excess spaces out of like the sort of traditional education system. So a lot of it is I'm thinking about what the impetus was for Freedom School, also what the credentialing process for that is like. There's a whole thing there. Also the experimental college at San Francisco State. So a lot of people know like, yeah, the ethnic studies movement, but really alongside and a little bit before the College of Ethnic Studies proper, there was a proposal called the Experimental College. So the Experimental College was really this idea of the campus and community through line being lived out in real time. And what I mean by that was that would be teachers and students from Hunters Bay viewpoint, like, you know, Hunters Bay View in San Francisco, they were just as much teachers and instructors as the students at San Francisco State. And that's actually, the Experimental College is what got Sonia Sanchez to SF State in the first place. So there's that, and then there's the sort of longer history of Sabbath schools, Saturday schools. I also really got into education first through working in this program called Prison to College Pipeline. This was in 2007 when we were talking about like the early stages of that. So we would go into a facility where folks were incarcerated, and we would do sort of teaching and workshops with them. And that, like, so all of those confluence of things is why I think terms like the grassroots, though they may seem dated, I think still have value and traffic in terms of the importance of the external spaces are that the legitimizing structures with which we vet the efficacy and value and worth of an education cannot just be institutional. And that's actually especially dangerous for Black people, because so many of the sites where we actually experience education that is not explicitly sort of harmful and violent to us have to be constructed outside. So it's a whole argument for a different metric. Also, thanks to my partner who brought this book here, shout out to Makana, that's helpful because it also gives me a chance to think through high schools in Black communities aren't really just high schools, you know, they become educational sites for other people. The church isn't just a like, so you know what I mean? So it's even a disrupting of the function of the institutional space itself. But thank you for the question. It just gave me a chance to get some more of that.
There's just a comment that was occasioned by listening to both your papers. And I think one of the things about the idea of listening, which is so central to pedagogy or to music, a lot of it is premised on a certain kind of injunction. In pedagogy in particular, someone speaks and you listen, you're called upon to listen. Or when Sun Ra creates that wall of sound, there is an injunction to listen in another way. But if one thinks about other forms of listening, particularly when we think about subaltern forms of listening, when I think about the experience of Dalit and untouchable acquisition of education, listening is through overhearing, because you're never in the space where the teaching happens. Your listening is always something that is illicit.
Yeah.
So, and I think this is a common shared experience between Dalits in India and young Black students who go to Ivy League and they're forced to sit apart, where their very act of listening is forced to be an overhearing. So I was just trying to think about the various, how should I put it, the various, the landscape of listening, as it were, and how one thinks about it. That's just a thought.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I'm not suggesting at all that listening is any kind of, directional thing at all. Obviously, it's a matter of being in a certain space, and how that happens is probably interminably complex. I mean, I don't even know if we could name it that way, or how many names would we give to it. And overhearing is a great term, very, very interesting and very evocative term in all kinds of ways. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, just quickly, thank you for that, because it also, there's a kind of subversion that's happening with the overhearing. Is it aware that I'm overhearing, which brings into the room like different levels of awareness, different levels of understanding, but also being ignored, right? Like there's this idea that if you're in a position to overhear, are people worried about you overhearing? They think so little of you that they, don't even think that the overhearing will make a difference materially. But you still do it because, you're not just working on that structure. Additionally, I was thinking about this on the instructor side, Jarvis Gibbons's recent book, Fugitive Pedagogy, really begins with the sort of teacher who has like the one book here, and then there's sort of the alternate curriculum here. So when the person coming to evaluate the school so that kind of move as well, and that different modes of pedagogy involve subverting at different times. And, we could talk about transparency, opacity, all those things. And it just because the comment gives us the occasion, right, to also, think about this idea of seeking education, right? And that was the thing that I think the capitalist critique of the education system we exist in right now is necessary and really strong. And I think that people want to learn for reasons beyond just material gain. And I think overhearing speaks to what's at stake. Like someone is overhearing, yes, maybe because I want to learn what I need to do to, make my rent and do that. Yeah, like do all the things, undercommons it all, for sure. And the overhearing may be prompted, right, by other things as well. So, thanks.
Thanks, Christopher, and thanks, Stathis. Christopher, a comment, and Stathis, a question. We had a discussion at dinner last night. Stathis, Jason, and Adi were there. My high school in Jamaica, produced this quite remarkable range of people from Stuart Hall to Charles Mills to David Scott, earlier on Michael Manley. And we were basically saying this institution developed to basically educate administrators for the British, to take them out of the colonial situation into the neo-colonial situation. Nonetheless, also created this quite remarkable cadre of anti-colonial thinkers, to say the least. And it just strikes me as for us to consider how that might relate to Black American experience, and what's going on here. I know I'm not asking the question properly, but it really is that in the heart of the program to miseducate people, you have this sort of counter movements going on. I'm just throwing it out there because we raised it last night. We didn't have an answer for it. My question for Stathis is, why you chose these three? What was the thinking, or what was the listening behind the choice of these three remarkable pieces, all very different? Yet, I'm not going to try to answer it, but I see a charisma in all of them, which unites them. But I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I can respond. Thank you for the comment. And one thing I think is, this will maybe come back to Ferguson in the U.S., I think that's a bit different, is, or similar, I think that you find some of those maybe intellectual genealogies somewhat in maybe the collegiate sense, but I think Ferguson's critique about sort of the assimilation and how, like the university education sort of depoliticizes in a way that I think like high school, not necessarily does. And what I guess I'm getting at is you might have people who went to the same college, but I don't think there is a strong political, through lines in there. And I guess I can maybe think of it, maybe you have it departmentally. There might be people like, I came through this department, right? And that department becomes the thing that kind of congeals them, perhaps in that way. A quick note on my high school that's funny, of nothing. Ta-Nehisi Coates graduated from my high school. That says nothing of anything beyond just he did. But he was actually at another school, Poly. I think he had a situation happen there, went there for 3 years, finished up at Woodlawn. Longer story. But I do think what I experience and maybe see is, I think in the U.S. it mirrors these kind of intellectual communities that maybe art occasions. Actually, maybe that's actually a part of how I would think about it. I think that the aesthetic occasions maybe what the high school did there, the aesthetic occasions, the coming together of the thinkers, the writers, the artists, and then you sort of have those like intellectual traditions that become mapped through the aesthetic, because the sort of site of the high school, you have it, honestly, if I'm fully, like, you have it far more in something like sports than you do in this, right? In the US, you kind of have sort of these sports high schools, like Hoover High School in Alabama is like known for, like, so there's that, but I'd love to think about it, and then post-integration, I think it changes. I think pre-integration, you totally would have that. Pre-1955, pre-Brown II, and sort of the outcome of that, you definitely, even in Baltimore, like we have high schools that are like canon for just major black thinkers, but I think post the sort of all deliberate speed of Brown, there's kind of the brain drain, busing thing that we talked about that created a different dynamic, maybe, but it's fun. I gotta think about that, I like that.
Yeah, Brian, I don't know if I can answer this really in any satisfactory way, because, I mean, I wavered over this because I wanted to do something voice. Then I thought if I do anything else, this will be too long. I could have done the space chants, but I really felt that would really be unfair because it really requires some talk about it. And then, the Julius Eastman piece, because I'm working on that, that's a separate thing. And he was very present in my, desk of year desk. Helga Davis is someone we collaborated with, and so I talked to her a lot. And she's just, I mean, her range of her voice is just, I mean, it's kind of like, you lose your words, right? What can I say about it? And then, this other thing just was a complete happenstance. It just came through because some friend who is an anthropologist, found this. And I thought, okay, here, because I was moving into experimental music, okay, jazz, of course, but more than jazz. And then, I began by talking about, contemporary experimental music, and I wanted to show something that's really, really kind of off the charts that people wouldn't be aware of. Not you guys, but I mean, just people would not normally think of. There's so many other examples. So it's really an arbitrary choice, but I did want to end with a voice, and in a way, just the voice. And I thought that it shouldn't just be just art voice, voice of trained singers, but voice of a woman who is, whose voice has trained her animals. I mean, so there's a kind of, so I wanted that aspect to come out and to just simply, a lot of times I work by juxtaposition. I'd like, and even in my writing, I just like to just put things next to each other and just let them sit there. It's not that I'm not interpreting, but I try not to do as much as I can, not to do too much of that. And so that's not a satisfactory answer, but that's what that was.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm going to ask yet another version of questions that have been asked. It's a fascinating discussion because, the questions coming from Alex, from Dilip, from Brian, in particular, have laid out a way in which your papers, in a way that I was not quite aware of when you've both finished, are really in a kind of conversation, particularly around this concept of miseducation. But I think I want to ask a version of the questions that have been asked of Stathis. And I'm interested, my version of it is, why listening? I mean, in particular, why isn't your concept music? And the reason why I ask that is because you seem to be I mean, there's something really important in what you're doing that seems to be around something like autonomous understanding. You sort of began by that. You began with the Pythagorean parable about the veil, and so clearly you're interested in doing something around autonomous understanding that would not seem to apply to language, listening to language. Language does not work like that. In fact, there's a kind of relationality to language. So you're interested, you're drawn to something around the autonomy of the listening experience. But Alex asked you about Sun Ra. Brian asked you about your choice of excerpts. You know, you could sort of say the same thing about Julius Eastman that Alex was prodding you to elaborate on also. I mean, he clearly a composer who is working out of a deep sense of oppression, racial oppression in the United States in particular, and sort of gender oppression. So I mean, I sort of, so the question is really, yes, why? I mean, why not music? What is it that is specific about listening in particular? And do you want to sort of do a bit more to qualify or to sort of nuance the importance of autonomy in the work that you're wanting to do with that?
So, obviously, music is, music is incredibly, it's my passion. So it's, it is essential to everything, including even when I write and have written about very abstract things and philosophical things. But, so it's always been there. And writing for me, of course, not just poetry, but writing for me is always a matter of rhythm. So, of course, okay, everybody would say, but you're an ideas guy. Well, I am, yeah, it's true. I think that what I was trying to, this is a very important question. It's a bit personal, I guess, and pardon me for that. But I am in a certain moment where I'm really trying to recede from the conceptual sphere. And this, in our political concepts meetings, Adi knows this, I've been raising issues about, the obsession with the concept. So it's the easiest move in this case, when one is, let's say, in a moment of confrontation with that, is to move to music. Because that's an easy move to make. Because of all, I don't need to explain, right? The whole romantic baggage about music as something that is beyond language and so on. But that wasn't satisfactory for me, although music is it will be clearly at the heart of this project. I thought that as I said in the beginning, that the problem of listening is serving 2 or 3, let's call them needs on my part, or demands that I see upon me to displace emphasis on speech, right, and of course words, and language in that sense, and therefore ideas and concepts and analysis, and to turn me towards that which is aesthetic in the literal sense, that is to say sensuous, and but keeping, otherwise I wouldn't be here, keeping the political significance of that. I'm not doing some kind of pure aesthetics, and I never have, and it's not interesting to me. Not in writing anyway. So listening cannot just be a matter of only music, because it's actually something that happens all the time, that we live, that's what we do. And that's what we do in the education. That's the pedagogical situation. That's essential to it. We don't need Pythagoras for that. I mean, that's the case. And so then I wanted, and I have no idea what this project is going to be, if I'm ever going to write it. I mean, I have no idea. But if I'm going to write, it's going to be a very different kind of writing, and it's not going to be about music, really, or there will be music in it. It will be about what listening means in terms of living, in terms of bodies and encountering each other, under what conditions, of course, and what this might mean politically speaking, as I mentioned in passing, democracy is a state of listening. I want to really displace attention to ideas, concepts, language, analysis, and so on, while keeping many of the frames in which these elements are essential. So I don't really, you know, it's very preliminary, and I don't really know where it's going to go. But it's not just about music. It's about, you know, how do we listen to the world? I mean, think about what's going on everywhere we go, you know, in the subway, wherever we are. Everybody's got things in their ears, okay? Everybody's listening to stuff, but they're not really listening to what's going on around. I mean, I love listening in on headphones and being immersed in sound. I mean, it's an incredible pleasure. But I find it kind of crazy that you do that while you're walking around. You know, I mean, you know, while you're not really hearing even the whispering that goes on, or whatever else the person next to you, or some random, or overhearing, you know, some random conversation, or hearing languages that you don't understand. One of the most incredible pleasures for me is to hear language that I don't understand. The sound of the human voice, people talking, I don't know what they're saying. It's an incredible pleasure, incredible experience. So I want to be able to get into those domains, so I can't restrict it to music. That's the best I can do with your question.
And you began with cosmic listening. Like listening.
Yes, that was up on purpose, exactly, because I want that to be there, exactly.
Thank you very much for both very inspiring presentations. And I have somewhat of a half-baked comment for Stathis, and it's somewhat much more, I guess, existential kind of question for Chris, because we do the work at RISD together. So, so for Stathis, I'm a historian of photography, so I may be going to a completely different direction. But I was especially inspired by your comment on how listening is not a technique, but an experience. And that really resonates with the work by Tina Kemp on listening to images. And I'm constantly encountering the limits of the visual and reading of the visuality in what I do. So Tina Kemp's work really inspired me to really think about the haptic and somatic experience of photography and photographic archives. So perhaps even if you're thinking or writing about the autonomy of listening, I think listening is incredibly relational also,
absolutely.
in a multisensorial way. I'm also thinking about Fred Moten's In the Break, and also the chapter on critique on Roland Barthes and how it suppresses sound of black moaning. So these two works, I think, really resonate with your work, and I really appreciate the way you brought forth that it is an event rather than a technique. And for Chris, so we do the work of educating, quote unquote, difference in art historical education. I feel like some of us are hired for also the purpose of doing that. And when teaching and working towards, again, quote unquote, globalizing art history, I feel like much of the work we do is consumed through I don't know if it's a right way to put it, but the epistemology of DEI work that is deeply embedded in racial capitalism. So in thinking about the work we do down the hill, I wonder if you have any comments on, or perhaps what we can do to go beyond this, what it looks like or feels like a gridlock of doing the work of racial capitalism.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so yes, that we think it's very sort of ontological, all of those things. One way is, I think what would be helpful is maybe distinguishing among that those of us who maybe want to do that. Like, I think we have to be honest about some of our colleagues want to do the minimum. You know, they're sort of the price of the ticket that Baldwin talked about. We have some colleagues who are fine with that. Like, they've paid the price of the ticket, they're here, they want to engage in that type of work. And I say that not sort of offhandedly, but I think usefully, because if we know who we need to do the work of imagination and creating, and if we can figure out who we need to do that with, then we get more time to do that, as opposed to constantly convincing people that something needs to be broken with the status quo in the workplace. Because I think like a lot of time is wasted convincing people that there needs to be some sort of break, rupture, disjuncture, alternative space, as opposed to those who think, hey, we need to think about like alternative ways of doing this and then getting to doing it. So that's one. The other part, and specifically for those of us like down the hill, by down the hill we mean RISD, for those who maybe aren't aware, I think that something that I've sort of been mulling over in relation to that question, and I think is possible. So one is very practical in terms of like who ends up in the classroom. Like if there are ways that we can think about having certain conversations with certain students, because often places like this, the people who would benefit most from these conversations are like priced out, opportunityed out, schedules, the students who want to take your class can't get in, like, so there's very pragmatic things like who gets in what classes. Secondly, though, I do think that there's something interesting, this goes back maybe in the Jason's talk earlier, there's something interesting historically that's happened to the word diversity that I actually did not think would happen. Like to me, diversity 5-10 years ago was fully co-opted. It was like, it's gone, it's whatever. Like we've so moved on from that as having any value. Like that the term diversity is volatile again is just interesting. Like I'm really just interested by that because like that term seemed to be so far gone. And now, so that may actually occasion an opportunity to bring in more radical ways of thinking about education, because I think that opens up a break. I think that provides a break is, hey, you all presented this really vanilla thing, and they still think that's super radical. So why don't we just be super, like, why don't we just be this thing, because you're already gonna get said that you do it anyway. So that's what that's maybe a pedagogical opportunity, I would say, is because as much as you water it down, it's still gonna be deemed whatever you say you're not trying to do. So we should just do it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I mean, both Tina Kamp's and, of course, Fred Moon's work are incredibly important to me. I'm in a conversation with them, so I agree completely. But I want to make clear one thing, which I should have done with when Tim asked. When I use the word autonomy, I'm not thinking content. I'm not thinking anything of that kind. Autonomy really, literally, first of all, it's a political, not an ontological notion. It does not mean self-sufficiency of the subject or anything of or any kind of self-referentiality. It is always social. There is no such thing as autonomy of the individual. That's a nonsense idea. And so, nor am I talking about autonomy of art, let's say in the way that Adorno would speak. That's not. I value that in some ways, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when I said sort of an autonomous auditory event, or an autopoetic moment, I'm thinking always in social relational terms, always in terms of encounter, contestation. There's never a kind of neutral encounter. Of course, that never happens, and so on. Yeah. So yeah, of course, I agree. Yeah. The synesthetic element is essential to it. Yeah.
The last question, a short question, please, Mike, and short answer. We have to finish.
Thank you, and sorry for being the last question and for asking one in the first place, perhaps. But I was thinking, it's the political concepts, right? So I'm thinking of the politics of listening in terms of what is rendered sensible, and also in terms of what can be made available for an education or miseducation, right? So there are some things that you won't say to a teacher. There are some things you will suppress if there's an overhearer that you know about or suspect. My phone is listening, right? All of these kinds of things that then prevent education from happening by taking over the space through an ear of some sort, right? And that's a teacher. Again, that's a principle, something like this. therefore, you're not allowed to make your own voice sensible in a certain, not available to be sensed, right? And I'm wondering, is democracy, or is there some other way to spread modes of listening that would allow for the extension of certain situations or contexts to be meaningful, rather than just decontextualization as an education? If that makes sense.
Okay, let's see. You get the time to think. If you want.
Oh, I'll be quick. How do you say quick? So I'll give you an artwork. Roy De Carava is a photographer who I actually thought about when you responded, because I'm thinking about all of the photographs of interstitial spaces, right? The hallway, the street, the subway. So my short answer would be finding sites of transience to sense what can't be sensed in the static space.
Yeah, I agree, of course. The only, I don't even know if I have anything I would add. But I mean, obviously, the state of listening, democracy, the state of listening is both a space, but also something that has to be learned. It's all about education. Listening, was the whole point. It's not something that you either inherit or you learn as a technique. It is really something that comes through a certain space of learning. And silence is essential to it, by the way.